Hi, this is Molly here with another episode of Ekoji. Today I'm joined by Gordon Bermant. Gordon Bermant is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Over the years at Penn, he has taught courses called The Embodied Mind, Judges and Judging, Psychology and Law, Psychology and Religion, and, most recently, The Religious Mind, Embodied, Embedded, and Engaged. He is currently preparing a book with that title. Gordon's connection with Ekoji began in 1986 when he attended his first Obon celebration at the temple, held in the parking lot next to the business condo site that the temple occupied between 1981 and 1998. Thanks to the wisdom and compassion of Reverend and Mrs. Suji and unfailing religious devotion demonstrated by the lay leaders, Gordon felt at home and has identified as a Shin Buddhist ever since. Encouraged by Reverend Suji, Ken N., and Brian N., Gordon went up the officers' line at BCA, serving as vice president between 2000 and 2003, president-elect between 2004 and 2005, and president 2006 to 2007. What Gordon does best is go to school. That led him to a PhD in psychology and, 30 years later, a law degree. He has taught at UC Davis, the University of Washington, and Penn. He worked for 21 years as a research psychologist and manager for the federal court system, and has consulted with the Justice Department, Freddie Mac, and other public and private clients. But since leaving D.C. and Northern Virginia for Philadelphia in 2009, he has fulfilled his ambition to be a perpetual student, using teaching as a cover story. He is active as a minister's assistant at the Seabrook Buddhist Temple, primarily offering weekly kanwa and occasional brief lecture courses on Buddhist topics.
All right. So, our first question, how did you decide Shin Buddhism was the right path for you?
I met Reverend Suji at Obon, 1986. I was working in the government and I was managing a bunch of people, and one of them, one day, was at lunch in his office reading the Big Green Book. It was the Big Green Book then, the Buddha Dharma, the book that BDK published. And so I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, this is the Buddha Dharma." And because I'd grown up in California and went through all the 60s in Northern California, and that was influential, so I knew a little bit about Buddhism, but it was just Buddhism equals Zen, and there wasn't anything else, etc. And so I really didn't know what this book was about. And I said, "Well, where did you get the book?" And he said, "Well, I got it at the Ekoji Buddhist Temple." "Where's the Ekoji Buddhist Temple?" "Well, it's on Rolling Road in Springfield." And I said, "That's about 3 miles from my house." I lived in Burke, on Lake Braddock. And so I said, "What? When this is interesting to me." He said, "Well, look, we're having our summer festival. We call it Obon. It's coming up, and then we're shut down for the rest of August. You should come then." So I did. And the Minyo dancers, I got there and, I didn't realize how much work it was. This is, it was the office condo. And Obon was held in the parking lot of the office condo. And the regular lay people had been out there sweeping and putting up the lights. And there was a whole tradition, which still goes on today, the way you string the lights and all of that, even though it's shifted over. And so I was looking around, feeling very alien, didn't know a soul. The guy that was working for me, who had invited me to come, wasn't there yet. And so finally he showed up, and he introduced me to Reverend Suji, who was in his robe. It was blistering hot. And Reverend Suji was in his robe. Mrs. Suji was standing beside him, and there were a couple of lay people there. And so Ted Coleman introduced me to him. he shook my hand. He said, "Well, you should dance." The circle was going on, and I said, "No, I don't do that." You know, uh,
They don't really
I
take no
don't
for an
do that.
answer.
He did not take no for an answer. Very patient. Oh, come on, you can do it. You'll enjoy it. It's a no. Thank you, but no. And he really kind of insisted. So I got out there. Everybody, I'm sweating. Well, you know what it's like in the summer, and I'm throwing fish over my shoulder or casting a net or whatever it is that you're doing in those dances. And I'm doing it for a while. And I said, well, yeah, I can do this. I'm a pretty coordinated guy. Uh, I can follow instructions. So I began to get into it, and I'm moving and feeling pretty good about it. And I look over, and here's Reverend Suji, and he's looking at me, and the two people who are with him are looking at me, and they're all laughing. I mean, they're laughing. And I said, oh, shit, what did I do? I was so embarrassed. And then I realized that somehow, although they were laughing at me, that it wasn't hostile. There was something about the interaction that I couldn't get angry at them about. I was embarrassed, but I didn't feel humiliated, I suppose. And I thought, well, what is this? Uh, and it kind of intrigued me, and I realized there was something more I would like to learn. It was at that level. It's very emotional. It wasn't intellectualized. That all came later. Uh, so I
Oh,
just
there's
started.
still hope.
So I started coming back, and at first it really was, for those few. Maybe after they started again, because Obone kind of capped the season, and and then so when they opened up again after Labor Day, uh, it was so different. It was just this office condo with the chairs in it, and the Nigene was not raised. It was just flat, um, and the service was absolutely the same every week. Uh, we chanted in Pali, and then we did usually Chusege, but sometimes we chanted Chuni Rai, sometimes uh, uh, Sambutsige. Um, and Reverend Suchi did it, and he would give the Dharma talk, and I didn't, and he gave it in English, but I didn't really understand much, and I continued to feel alien for a while, and I had no idea about Namo Amida Butsu, none, no clue, and didn't understand. I mean, I was so ignorant that when they said Amida Buddha, I thought, what? I couldn't hear it even. Uh, but I kind of persevered. And why exactly I persevered, I don't know, but I did. And one thing led to another, and so on. And at a certain point, I began to feel comfortable, and he was always welcoming, very welcoming. And the lay people, the people who came, of course, a larger proportion of Japanese American than now, by a long shot, and many were Nisei, so they were kind of older. Um, the Nakamuras and the Kondos, who are still, uh, there, and both are now, Kenny and Norm are dear friends. Uh, the I don't know, it just became more natural, and I tell other stories in that article I wrote for the pamphlet I wrote for the American Buddhist Studies Center. Um, but that's how I got into it. And I knew within 6 months that this was where I wanted to be, that this was home. I had to take kind of an extended leave because that was about from the temple, because that was about the time I went back to school. I went to law school at night, uh, that was in 86. And in the fall of 87, I started law school at night. And that was 4 years of
Mm.
when's this going to become fun? And it never did. Uh, and, uh, and that kind of, well, if you can imagine, it was just, and I was working full time, of course,
Mm.
and taking the 17H bus, into downtown, and then to the or then when that shifted, Pentagon, and take the subway to, just live that bureaucrat's life. Those were long days. That was a lot of work. But then, of course, when I graduated and got back into it, then it was a new world for me because I was free from that hassle of going to school every night. Just to talk about Reverend Suji and his impact on me and what it was, and I mentioned that first time I met him, his sense of humor was very important to me. And that arose in another context that I talk about in the pamphlet when I, because of my nature, I'm an enthusiast and obsessive compulsive. And so I started volunteering around the place like you guys do, and was sweeping up in behind the Nigene in where the temple was where his office was and storage and that kind of stuff, little, you know, that kind of thing. And I would sweep up, and he had a little table just outside his office, and beneath the table he had two pair of slippers, um, Japanese slippers, and inside the soles were beautiful calligraphs. He had wonderful calligraphy, and so these beautiful calligraphs. And of course, because I was absorbing Buddhist reading, just crazy, uh, then I thought, oh, the 30 marks of the Buddha's body,
Right.
and these marks on the bottom on the soles of the Buddha's feet. There must be something like that involved in these calligraphs, a matter of some esoteric significance. So I got, but how can I ask him about that? Would it be rude? Would it be, just unspeakably non-Japanese to broach this with him? Um, so I finally got my courage up, and I said, Sensei. I'd learned Sensei by that time. I said, Sensei, I couldn't help but notice your slippers there and the calligraphy, beautiful calligraphy. May I ask you, please, the meaning of those symbols, of those calligraphs, characters? And he looked at me, and I can just think, oh man, this guy is so transparent, he's thinking. And, and, and he looked at me, got very serious. And then he kind of got close and he said, indoors, outdoors. And I felt the same way as I had when I saw him laughing at me in the dancing. Like, come on, get over it, will you, please? And so we both started to laugh, and that was a real lesson for me. And he had that way of being real. He was never ever pretentious. Never ever did he give me what I think of as the wisdom of the East routine. Uh, he was an extraordinarily down to earth person who, nevertheless, uh, uh, he understood Shinjin. He understood what it meant to awaken to the truth of Amida Buddha. He'd been there, done that, knew what he was talking about. Uh, and had for decades by that time. I mean, he'd been bishop of BCA for 8 years. He had been invited to come to BCA from Canada after he'd founded the Toronto Buddhist Church right after the war, still suffering discrimination in Eastern Canada. He traveled all over Canada, and his work led to the establishment of a number of the temples. When he and Mrs. Suji, who met in the camp and got married, when they came to the east, but there were travel restrictions. I mean, it was a very difficult life. But in that, he basically built the Buddhist churches of Canada, now called, Jodo Shinshu. They've changed their name just in the last less than 10 years. And then they invited him to be director of education for BCA. And he came down and revolutionized education. He drove all up and down the West Coast with great stacks of the books that BTK, the book Dendo Kyokai, published then and still published. And he, distributed them all over the place and gave talks all over the place. He really made the first serious educational outreach in English for BCA. And after he'd done that for a few years, he got elected bishop. And it was when he was bishop that BCA bought the house in San Mateo, which BCA still owns. And then at the end of that time, he made a deal with Yehan Numata that if Mr. Numata would support it financially, he'd move himself and his wife and 5 daughters to National Capital Area and establish a temple in the National Capital Area. That was their bargain. He would do it, and Numata would pay for it. And he did it, Numata's still paying for it. Yeah, so I'm so grateful to Reverend Suchi, and over the years become increasingly appreciative and deeply appreciative of Mrs. Suchi. She really, very, very special person. And I felt her compassion, her Buddhist love, I would say. I felt it for over 30 years. And she's one of the great emotional constants in my life. And she was just always there. And the other women of the temple, they did a lot of cooking in the early days in the tiny little kitchen over on Rolling Road. And the food was delicious, and everybody knew the routines, and you could just see it working out, and you understood how food preparation and cleanup was all an unspoken ritual. It really was a religious act. And the itadakimasu at the beginning of the meal was said with some sincerity. Itadakimasu, namo amida Buddha. Namo amida Buddha, itadakimasu. That meant something. We have so very few rituals in Jodo Shinshu, in the BCA form. Probably more in Japan, but relatively few. She was just so good at being there and opening their home. They lived in different places during the years, say from 86 to almost 2000 when I left Northern Virginia to come here to Philadelphia. And they lived for several years right I don't know where you're sitting, Molly, but if you're in the social hall, in the Sangha hall, that's where they lived, because that was the house that we bought and then built the Hondo building new and refashioned the home that was there into the Sangha. And I can't say enough about my appreciation, my fondness for Mrs. Suji, and that I mean that just that made a lot of difference to a lot of people. And at one point, I would say probably in the late '90s, we went through some difficult times because we had some lay members who were difficult people, uh, and there was friction, a lot of friction on the board. And I was president for part of that time, uh, but it was very unpleasant for a brief period of time. And um, Reverend Suchi's approach to that was to kind of just be very quiet, very silent, and then every now and then just say something that he would decide what the course of action would be after we'd been monko, 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 just arguing with each other and snarling and publishing anonymous memos that would come out and so on. Oh yeah, it was a poisonous atmosphere for a couple of years. Um, and Mrs. Suchi just floated through that thing. I said, well, she's just amazing. She really demonstrated what Jodo Shinshu is all about.
My next question actually is a complete direction change. What religious leadership roles have you served in, and how would you describe your leadership philosophy?
Okay. Well, um, in BCA, one story, out of BCA, another story. But in BCA, as I mentioned, I joined the temple. I fell in love with Jodo Shinshu, and just felt so comfortable with Reverend and Mrs. Suji, and came to feel very close to Kenny and Norm and uh, a number of the other traditional members who had been there from the beginning, particularly to develop the Dharma school. Largely, that was what brought them together originally. And my kids were all older, out of the house, and I'd been unmarried for quite a while, got remarried, and so on. So that that was just a part of my, non-Buddhist life, really. And uh, as at a certain point, somebody said, "Well, why don't you become president of the temple?" So I did become president of the temple. And then, really, through Kenny Nakamura, I followed him into the Eastern District and became president of the Eastern District in the late 1900s, right about the same time as the new temple got built, the one that you're in now. That I became EDC president, and then I got invited from California to run for vice president of BCA, and that I was elected, and that wouldn't have happened but for, I think, some lobbying on my behalf. Brian Nagata, who knows everybody in BCA and has known everybody in BCA for decades. But I had supporters who were already on the BCA board of directors, and they advocated on my behalf, and I got elected. And I served as vice president, one of the vice presidents of BCA for 4 years, and then got elected president-elect. And which, as you may know, that the way that works, you don't get elected president of BCA. You get elected president-elect, and you serve for 2 years as kind of the person in waiting. And it's wonderful 2 years because you don't really have many official responsibilities, but you get to go around because people know you're going to be president. So they start treating you nicer. And then you get to be president, and then of course nobody treats you nicely anymore, because then you're the source of all the munku, all the complaining. And but I was president of BCA from 2006 into 2006 2007, and that was when we broke ground for the Jodo Shinshu Center in Berkeley. And so I was president during that time, and made, or advocated for and voted for and pushed for taking BCA into the debt that we had to incur in order to get that building built on anything like a reasonable schedule. And that made a number of people very angry because the Japanese American culture despises debt. They really did not want to go into deficit financing to build the Jodo Shinshu Center in Berkeley. And it was totally clear to me that unless we did it through deficit financing, it would never be built. And there were, fortunately, enough people who agreed with me that we went $7 million into debt to get that done. And I took a lot of grief from people because of that. But, I couldn't help. It just had to be done that way.
Right.
And they're still paying, but now it all worked out fine. I don't know how much grumpiness there still is among people, about it. Many of the people who were really furious, were older than I was at the time. Now there's almost nobody older than I am, who's still being active. But that's all taken care of because the only money we owe to our own endowment foundation. So all the debt is internal, and the church pays off the remaining debt to the endowment foundation at a very favorable interest rate. So as far as I'm concerned, that was a completely successful way to do it, and I feel completely vindicated by that. But I did ask, what leadership philosophy I think you asked about.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I think on the BCA side of my leadership history, I guess the decision I made, sometimes you have to make very unpopular decisions because they are the right thing to do for the true purpose of the organization you're leading. Incurring that debt to get the Jodo Shinshu Center built was necessary, it was wise, it was appropriate, and it was very unpopular. And now I think it's impossible not to understand that whatever the membership problems are of BCA, and they're profound. They are existential. Be that as it may, they would be worse if we did not have the Jodo Shinshu Center in Berkeley, because that is a wonderful location. It's a wonderful building, and it really symbolizes the continuity of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism in the United States in brick and mortar. And brick and mortar is an important part of any religious organization. Even in these days of people with, as I read in the paper the other day, there's some guy's got 900,000 followers on TikTok. And his father, who's also a evangelical minister, has 100,000 followers on Twitter. So we have 12,000 members in BCA but we have this wonderful brick and mortar uh, location in Berkeley and a rapidly deteriorating space in San Francisco. But that's a whole different story. So that's the answer to that question. Uh, and as far as my leadership outside BCA, I did manage some, I like to think, reasonably important developments in the federal courts, particularly from 82 to 86. I was managing about 50 computer scientists as we developed the software to run the administrative side of the federal court operation, including the bankruptcy courts, the district courts, and the courts of appeals. And that I did that without knowing very much at all about the technology involved. I mean, I just, that's not my field. And it's a bizarre story of how I got the position to run the so-called Innovations and Systems Development Division of the Federal Judicial Center. But the lesson I learned, and what I tell other people about leadership, is the big question that you have to answer is, whom will you trust? There are going to be people who know more about the work of your organization than you do, and you have to admit it, and among those people decide whom you're going to trust. And then you have to give them your trust and back them up and defend them if they do things that are unpopular. So that's my philosophy of leadership.
We only have one question left. Looking forward, what do you think is the greatest opportunity yet to be realized for either Ekoji or the larger American Shin Buddhist community?
Well, let me ask you a question. How many pledged members are there at Ekoji now?
Somewhere in the 60s, I believe.
That's more than were ever pledged while I was there, I think.
We did recently, we rolled out a new form of membership. We now offer virtual membership to people who can't take advantage of the physical location. And Andrea has been in charge of that initiative, and she's really done an incredible job. I think she's probably not going to jump on here and admit it, but watching that unroll and ways that people can interact and still share the Dharma with each other, even with COVID restrictions and not being able to have the physical building open, has been absolutely fascinating to watch.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like COVID has been with us forever, but I mean, I think we have to imagine the future of Ekoji without that, and yet take advantage of what we've learned. Actually, I think that is important. I think there have been real benefits in developing virtual communication. I teach the course that I teach at Penn, both this term and last term, has been totally online. totally with Zoom. I'm completely comfortable in Zoom. Uh, and I see no reason why, when everybody could take their masks off and when temple is offered on Sunday mornings in the traditional form, why there couldn't and shouldn't be a continued uh, virtual presence of Ekoji.
As of
Zoom,
right now, that is the plan.
yeah, Zoom is really good, and I don't mean Zoom technically. I mean this kind of communication. I mean, I never met you before. I never met Andrea before. Neither of you, etc., know me at all, and yet because we've been rehearsing this kind of virtual communication for a year, I feel at least as close to the two of you as I would if I had driven down to Ekoji for an interview with you in person. At least as close, and I honestly believe closer. My relationship to my students is not more distant uh, when when I'm teaching virtually. We are in face-to-face communication more intensely than if I'm standing in front of them in a classroom where they're spread out laterally and in depth in front of me. They're all, I mean, the Zoom screen allows, 20, 25 people on one screen. And I teach seminars, small classes. So I can have my entire class equally visible in front of me for the entirety of the time, and we can all share the screen. So I'm a big fan of not walking away from this medium when we can all take our masks off and be in person together. And I think it really could become the real outreach for Ekoji.
Thank you, Gordon, for sharing your experiences with us, and thank you to our listeners. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode, and make sure you hit subscribe to get notified of future episodes.